Hey everybody, my name is Mike Montgomery, and today I'd like to show you how to build this super simple but really sturdy workbench completely out of 2x4s. And guess what? It only costs about $100. So let's get started on Modern Builds. Before I cut anything, I ran all the 2x4s for the base through my planer. That way they would all be the same thickness and it would remove the rounded edges that a 2x4 normally has. It's not totally necessary, but if you have a planer, I would recommend it. Then I set up a stop block on my miter saw to cut all of the pieces for my 30-inch legs. Each leg is two 2x4s glued face to face, that way I had a good, strong leg. Now if you're asking why didn't I just use 4x4s, it's because this is a lot cheaper. I'll be using lap joints to connect the stretchers and aprons to the legs, and each leg piece is 1.25 inches thick after I planed it, so that's how high I set my blade and made sure my miter gauge was square. Making this lap joint is really simple if you've never done it before. Just use your miter gauge to make sure your piece is running square to the blade, and then take multiple passes to remove the material until you reach the fence. And once you're finished, the void should be the same size as the 2x4s you're using for the stretchers. But that's not the only lap joint we'll be making on the top part of the legs. I rotated the leg 90 degrees and then cut a lap joint the exact same size on that side. I know I wanted the stretcher on the bottom of my leg to start 5 inches from the floor, so that's where I started my lap joint. Then, I just continued to make multiple passes the same way I did on the top section of the legs to create that void. Remember, it's always good to sneak up on your cut. You can always take away more wood, but you can't add it back. Unlike the top of the legs, the bottom stretchers are offset. I wanted the apron to touch the tabletop all the way around. That's why I have that double lap joint. But because I don't need to do that on the bottom, this will provide a stronger joint. Remember to keep track of what side you're cutting this inside lap joint on. Instead of 4 identical legs, you need 2 pairs of legs. That way all the stretchers line up correctly. So that's why you saw me mark what side was going to be cut and up on the side that would be facing me. Now I know everyone doesn't have a table saw, so really quickly I'm going to show you how you can make these legs using just a circular saw. Making lap joints with a circular saw is not a fast process, and I could avoid cutting one set in the glue up. Instead of 2 30-inch pieces, I cut one 30-inch piece, then a 5-inch piece and an 18-inch piece. I clamped the 5-inch piece flush to the bottom of the legs. Then I used a scrap piece of the 2x4s we're using as a placeholder while I could line up the 18-inch piece. This gave me one set of lap joints, but I still had to cut the other. I used a 12-inch speed square to make sure I was always cutting square to my workpiece, and I just kept taking passes until I had a void the same size as that 2x4. This is a totally valid way of making these legs, it's just not as repeatable and it's not as fast as the table saw. After I cut all of my long stretchers, it was time to assemble my 2 frames for the legs. I used a 3/8 inch drill bit to create a recess for the screws to set in. I still used glue, I wanted it to be a really strong joint, but using screws allows me to screw everything together, making sure everything is really square, then move on to the next joint without having to wait for the glue to dry. I also used a 3/8 inch dowel to cover up those screw heads, and I used my Japanese pull saw to cut it flush. And just a quick reminder, these stretchers aren't the same length. The stretchers for the tops of the legs are 2.5 inches shorter than the stretchers for the bottoms of the legs. What's convenient about the other set of stretchers is that they are all 4 the same length, 24 inches in my case. Before gluing and screwing everything together though, I wanted to do a dry run to make sure everything was setting square and lining up right. Once I knew it was, I attached all of my stretchers permanently. Now, if you are somebody that wants this to be collapsible and really mobile and easy to transport from one place to another, do not glue and screw these together, only screw them. That way when you want to move it, you can unscrew these stretchers and everything flat packs. My plan was to make this tabletop 30 inches wide and 6 feet long, so I got 12-foot 2x4s and cut those in half. I didn't run these through the planer though, that way I wouldn't have to buy as many 2x4s. I also made sure not to use 2 pieces of the same 2x4 in any of the 3 sections of the glue up. That way I had a really cool random pattern. Now I feel like I'm beating a dead horse because I say this all the time, but make sure you're keeping your glue up really square. You're clamping on a flat surface and you're not over clamping things to make things want to bow in any particular direction. The other reason I'm gluing up my tabletop in thirds is so that I can run each of my sections through the thickness planer to remove those rounded edges. You can do this with a hand plane, a belt sander, or a handheld planer, but it's going to take a lot longer. Regardless how you decide to do it, once you have your 3 sections ready to go, you can clamp all 3 of them together. Oh, yeah. So this might be the flattest glue up I have ever done, and I attribute that to 2 things. The first being the cowl boards. You've seen me use these before. Essentially, they're just 2x4s with either masking tape or packing tape to protect them from getting any glue squeeze out on them and making this board stick to these boards. I sandwiched the tabletop between these 2 cowl boards and then added these clamps, which provide pressure that makes it to where the tabletop can't bow or dip because of that pressure. I also glued everything up on this piece of melamine. This tabletop obviously is bigger than my old tabletop. That's one of the whole reasons I'm building it. So I used this, that way my tabletop wasn't hanging over and being unsupported. There's a good chance that you watching don't have a workbench to build your workbench on. It's a little redundant, I get it. So if I were you, I would do this whole glue up on the floor. Now I know a lot of floors aren't perfectly flat. Mine isn't. So what I would recommend you doing is getting some caul boards just like these and shimming them up to make them all parallel with each other so you have a really good flat reference surface to start. That is the key. If you don't have a joiner and you don't have really fancy parallel clamps, it's really important to start on a flat surface. And then my last tip is to not over clamp your tabletop. That's when pieces tend to try and bow or bend or do all kinds of wonky things. If you have a little tiny gap somewhere, like I do right here, you can always come back with a mixture of sawdust and wood glue, fill that void, let it dry, and then when we come back with the belt sander to flatten everything, it's gonna blend in really nicely. Pro tip, it's good to have a dedicated sanding sweatshirt for projects like this, because they're messy. I think it's a good time to go ahead and send it to our sponsors. RZ masks are amazing. In fact, here's mine right here. Sorry, it's a little dusty. I've been using it a lot this week. Woodworking is dirty, especially if you're in a shop like mine that doesn't have a dust collection system. So it's really important to protect your lungs. And what I love about RZ masks are how comfortable they are and how quick they are to take on and off. That's it. Traditional respirators are really clunky and usually have at least 2 straps, one going over the back of the neck and one on top of your head. But not with the RZ mask. I can take my mask, put it on, put on my eyeglasses and my hearing protection, and it's all independent. If I want to take off my mask, great. If I want to take off my glasses, awesome. And same with the headphones. So if you're interested in supporting my sponsors, I'm gonna leave a link down in the description to RZ Mask. Not to mention, you can use the code ModernBuilds to get 15% off at checkout. Thanks, RZ Mask. Now that my tabletop was sanded and flat, I needed to square off the ends, so I used a scrap piece of plywood as a straight edge. I could only cut about halfway through the tabletop with my circular saw, so I cut one side, then flipped it over, and then I could cut the rest of the way through it. Now obviously I didn't have a perfect cut, so I used my belt sander to clean that up as well. Man, this was a dusty project. Now if your glue up wasn't particularly flat, you can always make a router sled to flatten it. I didn't need to, but I'll leave a link in the description to a video that shows you how if you do. I did want to point out the tiniest bit of bow that I do have in my tabletop, but it's so minimal that it's not worth the time for me to do a sled. As with anything, there's a lot of different ways you can attach your workbench top to your workbench base, but whatever you do, make sure you're taking wood movement into account. Otherwise, your top will want to bend up, bend out, and just get wonky and weird. Now my plan is to screw up through my apron and into my tabletop, but I'm not going to use my pocket hole drill bit even though I'm using 2.5-inch pocket hole screws. Pocket hole screws are awesome because they don't have a thread at the base. That means it's not going to grab the apron. Instead, it's only going to be grabbing the top. So I'm going to be drilling an oversized hole for the screw in the apron.
A standard pocket hole drill bit is 3/8 of an inch. I'm going to use a 1/2 inch bit, and for my pilot hole, I'll be using a bit that's just under 1/4 of an inch. So to start, I'm just going to drill straight through my apron. Try and keep everything as straight as possible. Now I can switch to my 1/2 inch drill bit and drill out a recess on the bottom of the apron. So as you can see, this section of the screw has plenty of room to move side to side with the wood as it expands, and because I drilled out the bottom so much, the head of the screw isn't going to get caught up either.
A lot of people recommend a lot of different finishes for workbench tops. Personally, I used 4 coats of Minwax polyacrylic. That way, wood glue wouldn't stick to the tabletop as easily. It's water-based and it's in a matte finish so that light won't reflect off my workbench as easily, for filming purposes. I've always said that shop projects really aren't my thing. I prefer designing for form rather than utility or function particularly. But I still have to say, there is something rewarding about building something that you'll be using every day, or at least in every project there on out.
Before I end this video, I want to answer as many potential questions that you guys might have. And the first is, what's with all of the bluish gray streaks in the wood? Well, to be honest, when I bought it, I really wasn't sure. I was just walking through my local Home Depot and I saw these 2x4s that had this crazy color to it. So I went ahead and bought them, brought them back, and I asked people on my Instagram, right here, what's the deal with it? And what I learned is that this is what people refer to as blue pine or beetle kill pine. Essentially, it's the exact same as any other 2x4 you would buy, but it is infected with a fungus that will eventually rot the trees and make them fall down. It's a really bad thing. Forests are totally being wiped out with this disease that apparently is transferred through beetles that burrow into the trees. So yes, it does look cool, but at a cost. On the other hand, this is wood that would have fallen down, so in a way, it's making use of something that would have been waste. Plus, it looks really cool. The second thing that I expect a lot of people to be curious about is whether I'm going to be putting a vise on the bench or dog holes or any kind of accessories. And the answer to that is yes, but I wanted to make this video extremely basic. There's a lot of different vices and things you can put on the bench, and I didn't want to suggest something to you guys watching it without really having tried it myself. My old bench does have a pretty crappy tail vise, and that was really convenient, so I expect to put one in the future. I also plan on putting in dog holes, maybe a power strip underneath so that I can plug in stuff like a belt sander or other tools that need a plug, but I don't necessarily want to suggest that to you guys because it might not fit your workflow. I will, though, link in the description 2 or 3 videos of really great workbench builds that might be helpful to you as well. They're different in style. Some of them are really simple, some of them are a little more complex, but I think there's really good information in all of those videos. The third thing I think people will be curious about is how heavy is this bench? Well, weight on a workbench like this is a good thing as long as it's not too heavy. That way, if I'm belt sanding something or heck, using a hand plane or anything like that, I know that the workbench is going to stay still. It's going to be a lot safer to operate and a lot less annoying because nothing's worse than having your workbench sliding around while you're trying to work on something. As you guys know, I move my tools around a lot because I like to shoot against this wall. So if I'm ever needing to pull out a table saw or a miter saw, I can just slide my workbench back and bring in any tools that I want to use right in front of it. It'll work great. Like I mentioned, I am so pumped with how flat this came out. I don't think I've ever made a glue up as flat as this, and I really attribute it to clamping against the melamine. Having a really flat reference surface was incredibly helpful. The floors in the shop, though, are not perfectly flat, so I did have to shim up a couple of the legs to make sure everything sat really nice. But overall, I am so excited about this. And finally, I want to talk about the big mistake that I made, and I feel like an idiot for it. So the game plan originally was to make this 3 separate components. The front frame for the legs, the back frame for the legs, and then these 24-inch stretchers that connect everything together. My plan initially was to glue and screw this frame together in the front and back, but keep these stretchers, the 24-inch stretchers, only screwed in. That way, I could unscrew these and collapse everything down really easily for transporting it. Well, once I already had one or two of the stretchers on, it hit me that I was gluing these things in and it was already too late. You can kind of see it on my face in this clip. But that's okay, this is still a relatively small footprint for moving around. I can disconnect the tabletop, and that's one solid piece, and then the base is a separate piece, and it's only 24 inches wide, which is still pretty compact, even though it can't flat pack like I wanted it to. So that's about it, and if you all watching have any questions about this project, make sure and leave that in the comments. I'll do my best to answer as many as possible, and if you gotta get in touch with me really quick, you can always send me a DM on Instagram. That's a quick way to get in touch with me. If you plan on building this project for yourself, make sure and check out the written article in the description. I'm gonna have a PDF plan for it, SketchUp file that you can download and edit if you want to change the dimensions, a materials and supplies list, along with step-by-step instructions telling you what I did in a little bit more detail. Not only that, on my second channel, linked in the description, I will be posting a video of designing this workbench in SketchUp from scratch. And what's awesome is this is a pretty simple SketchUp project to make. If you have never used SketchUp before, this is the perfect project to model along with me and learn the basics. Learn what buttons you need to press, what tools you need to know, so that you can design furniture in SketchUp as well. I can't recommend it more. Make sure and check out RZ Mask. They're amazing. Thank you for sponsoring this video. And if you're new to my channel, I'd welcome you to subscribe. That way you can stay up to date every time I post a new project, which is hopefully every week. Also, if you haven't seen all of my videos, I'll link a couple right here. That way you can check them out. Maybe you'll like them. Thanks to everybody for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you next time on Modern Builds.